October 31st, 2006. We are recording at the Blue Ash Library in Cincinnati, Ohio. Present are Mr. Robert Kinner, veteran of World War II, Joe Corneli, reference librarian of Blue Ash Library and our videographer, and me, Kathleen Atkinson, the interviewer. Welcome, Mr. Kinner.
Thank you.
We're honored to have you participate in this history project.
I hope I've got something that's of interest to everybody.
I know you do. Let's start. You tell us about yourself a little bit and your life before you joined the service.
Okay. I had early on developed a love of airplanes, purely as a spectator, but I loved it. And I joined the Civil Air Patrol, and I joined the Air Force Reserve cadet program, and everything that would get me near an airplane at the time. I only flew once as a younger person. In 1937, my mother gave my father and I tickets to fly from Cincinnati to Columbus. We thought that was wonderful, but that was the first and only time that I got near an airplane until I got into the service.
Right.
And so our first service, my first service was after high school. I actually joined the reserves the year before when I was a junior. An interesting little story there too, because I went to enlist in the Air Force Cadet Reserve, and I failed my physical because I was 125 pounds and I had to be at least 127. So they turned me down. And I went home and I ate a dozen bananas, and I came back the next day and I was 127 pounds. So I was accepted. That's how I got into the Air Force Reserve.
2 pounds.
Isn't that something? But the rest of the time, from then until I finished high school, it was just mostly inactive stuff, but some helping teach first aid classes, which the Boy Scouts had trained us for, and things like that you knew you were in a wartime status, even if you weren't doing anything about it at that time. I got my discharge from the Air Force Cadet program, and I re-enlisted then in the Air Force, enlisted personnel, which had no specific training stated or required. So when I reported for active duty, I didn't know what I was going to be or where I was going to go. It was just, I was going to be somewhere in Air Force. And that ended up being in Keesler Field, Mississippi, where I took my basic training. And we finished basic training and sat around for about 6 weeks almost before they decided where to ship us. Some were shipped out west, and of course, if they were shipped out west, you knew they were going to end up in Japan. And then the rest of us were shipped up to New York, or actually Fort Dix, New Jersey. And those who were up there, we knew were going to go to Europe. So once you had that settled, it was pretty straightforward from then on. We didn't have much in the way of any idle time. We were given a couple of days pass to visit New York City, and then we were ready to get on the boat. The group that I was with ended up being on the U.S. George Washington, which was a passenger ship that we had captured from the Germans in World War I.
Oh.
And we kept it. We didn't give it back to anybody. So that was the ship that we went overseas on. And once we got there, we did go through a storm of some note on the way over. There was a convoy, mostly victory ships, the things that were made out of sheet metal almost. But one of those in the group, there were about 12 or 14 ships, one of those exceeded the tilt angle sideways. I think it was 45 degrees was allowable, and they went to 47 degrees, and if you get that far, it's supposed to turn over.
Oh,
But it didn't. It was righted. We didn't lose anybody on the way overseas.
Good.
Just a bad storm.
good. So you were a very young man when you enlisted.
Yes, I was 17 in the reserves, and I was 18 on the 12th of July, and on August the 6th I reported for duty, so it was pretty fast after my birthday.
And do you remember the date
Of,
when you enlisted and
well,
when you set off?
because of that thing where they discharged me from the cadet reserve so that they didn't imply that I was going to be taking any flying training. That was in June, and then I had re-enlisted in the reserves and went in August.
And what year was that?
Well, August of 1945.
45.
Yeah.
Okay.
August the 6th, 1945, and that was an unusual day. My mother and dad took me to the train station. I got on a train and I went to Indianapolis, and in Indianapolis we were met by buses and taken down to Camp Atterbury and then on to final assignments from there. And I guess we knew by that time that we were going to stay in the Air Force, but we would not be on any kind of flight programs. And ending up down in Istres, in southern, or not Istres, I'm sorry. When we reported to Biloxi, Mississippi for our basic training, we were asked what fields we were interested in, and we were tested for all different kinds of fields. And I put down that I would like to go to photographer school, aerial photographer, have a big camera on the ship and on a plane and take those kind of pictures. But that was filled, and by the time they would have given me any kind of another choice, it was time to ship me out and go somewhere. So I didn't go to any training schools here in this country. And as a matter of fact, after about 4 or 5 weeks, just sitting and waiting after basic training was completed, they decided to send us overseas to Europe. We knew we were going to Europe because if you went to the East Coast for your prep area to go into the travel part of the Air Force, the others went out to Texas, and they were going to go to the Japanese occupied or formerly occupied areas. Anyways, we were real glad. When I came home, they gave us a 2-week furlough to come home between basic training and assignment overseas. It just happened to be over the Thanksgiving week, which was wonderful to be home for Thanksgiving Day. And shortly after that, then I left to go to New York, and from New York on to the U.S. George Washington. And that was, like I said, relatively uneventful trip, except for the one LST that tilted over a little further than 1 degree or 2 degrees further than it should have, and that scared everybody on that ship, of course.
Sure.
But we made it safely into Le Havre, and that was the first thing that would really surprise those of us who hadn't followed pictorially anything from Europe. The Le Havre docking area was filled with sunken ships. and they had to zigzag around them to find us a place to get up where we could unload. And from there, we went into Moore, Belgium, as kind of a staging center. And from there, we went to first in Feldbruck, which was the Air Force just outside of Munich, Germany. It was a basic training area, but we'd already had our basics, so we were looking for assignment. And we did finally get orders to report to the railroad station. We were going to go back to France, and we ended up, of course, down in Marseille, and because that's where the railroad ended, and we just had to wait until our group that we were eventually going to get attached to came to pick us up. And it was a real surprise because the air base at Istres was a divided air base between the British and the Americans, and we were expected, of course, to be stationed on the base, but that didn't happen. Our particular little group that we were being inducted into was stationed in a chateau, a big French chateau. Of course, it was fancy, but that was officers' quarters. We had a mess hall, wooden mess hall that had been added onto the back of the building, and there were 3 temporary wooden structures out in front, and we were in one of the front ones, and the mess hall was back in the back of the chateau. But it was a beautiful place. My wife and I went back to visit years later.
Did you?
Yes.
Do you have a picture of that
Yes.
that you can show us?
Boy. Oh, I should have started there. Yes, this building on the front is the chateau.
Okay, let's
And
turn it so.
This picture was taken after World War II was over by a friend that we had left over in France. And he went up and took a picture. This picture came from about 1995, 1994, something like that. So it's a relatively recent picture. It's now an old person's home.
Oh, it is?
Yes. But at the time we were there, it had been taken over by the Americans, and
It's beautiful.
it was there. Like I said, our officers were stationed in that building, and we were all stationed in the temporary
The
buildings out in
temporary
front.
buildings.
And there were quite a few of us when we first got there.
Did you get to go eat inside though?
Yes, the main, and just to the left of the main entrance to the chateau was the officers' bar, and occasionally we would be invited in for a drink.
Good.
Not very often. But later, of course, my wife and I went back and visited the place, and we just stayed in the distance and took pictures. It had become an old person's home. Quite good. So anyway, after being there for a very short period of time, we were broken down into the groups as far as what we were best able to do. And I ended up in the driving pool because they took us out for our driving tests, and driving a 6x6 2.5-ton truck is a little bit different than an automobile.
Sure.
No synchronized transmission, and a lot of things are bigger and heavier and harder to turn and things like that. But anyway, I think all but about 4 or 5 passed their driving test, and I got good recommendations from mine, and that's why we ended up then shortly after that going back up to Germany and picking up trucks to bring back to Istres for the rest of the outfit.
And why did you need all those trucks?
Well, we were hauling personnel a lot from place to place. All of these, this was a German prisoner of war camp, and the prisoners got work detail and only had an American supervising, and they went all over the air base, repairing this, repairing that, and so on and so on, because it had been damaged extensively by American bombing prior to the invasion of France. And it all had to be rebuilt. All of the the metal pads had to be placed. They were interlocking, and all of those had to be done for the airstrips as well as for the parking areas where the planes were. And so anyway, it was a big job getting this air base back to some kind of operational condition.
Right.
We had Boeing B-17s mostly on the American side. The British had their own airships at that time, and we were kept pretty busy just doing that. We were always having groups go out and repair this, repair that, so on and so on.
So this was actually after the war,
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
cleaning things up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and getting everything operable again that wasn't prior to that. We had the next nearest headquarters other than Istres would have been in Marseille, which is about 45 miles away. And there were some trips made daily to Marseille because that's where our mailman went, our mailman and enlisted GI, of course. He drove to Marseille every day and picked up the mail and brought it back. And if there was anybody that was on sick call, they were taken to the hospital in Marseille and had to be brought back again, of course. So there was a lot of driving back and forth there. And our nearest area of food supplies was even further away. It was more like 50 miles each way. And we made a ration run every day to pick up the food and bring it back. Now, that's not to imply that it wasn't prepared to eat. Sometimes they brought back just the kind in a box, you know. But we also brought back the food items that we needed to supply our restaurant that was on the base or next to the chateau, attached to it. And so we had these regular runs, and the one that I got on was the one to pick up the food and bring it back. And that served me well later on, because when they finally started downsizing a little bit, and the fellows who had been there during the war or right at the end of the war started to go home, and we, the new people on the block, started getting our rank and becoming something more important. And it was during that reshaping period that the mess sergeant was called to go home. And when he left, and I had been driving this pickup routine every day to pick up the food supplies, they decided that I was probably the best qualified. So I became the mess sergeant. And we built a little restaurant type place, eating place, dining room, right alongside of the temporary wooden building was added onto the back of the chateau. You couldn't see it from the road out in front, but it was there, and dinner was served there for the enlisted people. But the officers had a dining room inside the chateau, and that's where they ate. And like I said, there was the front room on the left side of the chateau. That was their bar, and occasionally we got invited in there for a special reason, have a drink with the officers.
Well, since you were not on the move, did you have pretty decent food most of the time?
Yes, most of it was in various stages of completion. You might get a can of sauerkraut and it may have the dumplings in it already, things like that. Semi-prepared food.
Huh.
We didn't often have to do anything clear from scratch.
Uh-huh.
But we had a large supply depot there, about 45 miles away. And like I said, daily we picked up the supplies. But when the acting mess sergeant was called to go back home, and I took over, it wasn't much longer after that the French decided we'd been in that chateau too long and they wanted it back. So we had to vacate the chateau completely, and that meant that we had to restore it to its original configuration. All of the little houses out in front had to be torn down, and
Right.
the mess or the sergeant or the mess hall in the back had to be torn down and all restored back to original condition, which was nice. It looked nice when we left. It looked like it did before we got there, or before the Americans got there. And it became an old person's home in years later, but that was far down the pike. When we left there, it was kind of up for grabs as to where we were going to be stationed, where we were going to have a place to lay down and sleep.
Right.
And the strange part about it was that we ended up inside of the stockade where the German prisoners were. They slept in tents, 2 men to a tent, and we had at one time over 1,000 of them. And when we first started, that dwindled gradually as they became eligible to return back to Germany. And the main thing that decided when they could go back was how well the area that they came from had been cleaned up yet. Because Europe generally, Germany in particular, had been bombed down to the point
It's
where
a
there were
mess.
very few buildings standing.
Yeah.
And on that first trip up to Germany to pick up more trucks, we stopped in Cologne, and that was an army base at that time, and they had good food and all that kind of stuff there. But it was a whole different experience to drive through Germany and try to pick up the food and everything. We didn't go there daily to pick up food, but we did have to go back up to Paris to get some supplies. The other supply areas that handled our requests were getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we had to go up to Germany to get the supplies, some of the supplies we used to get just locally. And like I said, the first trip up to Germany that I made was when we went up to bring the trucks back that we needed. And the second one that I made to Germany was to pick up prisoner of war clothing. They needed new shirts and trousers and socks and everything else. And all of those, of course, were labeled PW, prisoner of war.
Mm-hmm.
And so by that time, we had settled down a little bit. We weren't as large. We started sending some of them back up to Germany periodically.
Did you have any interesting adventures with those prisoners?
Only one, and that was a member of the elite German group, name escapes me.
The SS?
Hmm?
The SS?
Yes, SS. He had been a member of the SS and he escaped, and we had to go up and bring him back. But once we brought him back, they decided that it wasn't logical to keep this little, relatively small area, double fenced, spiked wire up over the top, and electrically charged at night. It wasn't practical to have that kind of security and us living inside the same base, the same fenced-in area, although theirs was separate in the sense that it was inside the bigger area. But our German prisoners were carried out every day to different assignments around the air base until they finally got it in pretty good shape. And we had, I've forgotten the technical name of it, but the airstrips and the parking areas for the aircraft were made out of interlocking metal plates that were 8-10 inches wide and 4 or 5 feet long. And these interlocked, and they were laid one after another to make a metal runway, and it was also able to float with the ground underneath if it had to. And when we got the news that our air base was going to be closed, we had to go back with the German prisoners, using them as work, and pick up all of that, and was loaded onto trucks and taken down to Marseille, put on a ship, and taken out in the Mediterranean and dumped.
Wow.
There was no future use for it. They're just sheets of metal that interlock. What were you going to do with them?
Right.
But in order to clean up the area and start to get ready to hand the air base over to the French again, that was the next logical thing.
Mm-hmm. Did you have dealings with those prisoners?
Yes, and even when we were out in the chateau, the German prisoners were brought out at that time to clean our barracks areas and do all of the other labor that was required around the chateau itself. But I'm going to take a minute. There was, as I mentioned earlier, I made a second trip up to Germany. And the second trip, actually, it was France, I'm sorry, it was not Germany. We went up to Paris, and there was just another fella and myself. And we drove a regular 6x6 truck up to Paris, and we were supposed to pick up clothing and stuff like that the Germans still needed. And they gave us a truck to take to Paris, selected because it was in very poor mechanical condition. But they had a large depot in Paris, and they could work on our truck. So the other young fellow that went with me, we delivered our truck to the people who were going to service it, as well as we had to pick up the German uniforms and bring them back for them, and some other things that needed to be fixed, and they were going to do all of that. And we waited, and we expected 2 or 3 days, and we'd get our truck back, load it up, and away we would go back to Istres again. Well, I don't know whether it was just friendly conspiracy or what, but the group who was supposed to repair our truck pulled the engine out and then said they didn't have one to put in. And the other young fella and myself ended up stuck in Paris for 14 days with nothing to do. We lived in the transient barracks that was a former department store that had been converted for our use. We slept in rows and rows of cots, but we had a place to sleep, a place to eat, and a place to clean up, so on and so on. And so we had a 14-day liberty in Paris. And our commanding officer got very concerned about it because he didn't have the authority to let us go and stay out in a civilian area for that length of time. But it all worked out eventually. We did get a new engine in it. We got the clothes we were supposed to get, and we took them back to Istres for the people. One of the things too that is of some interest, we were looking for ways to entertain ourselves while we were there, and there were lots of ways, there were lots of places to go, but one of the most traveled to was Aviation, which was just about 35 miles north of where we were stationed. And Aviation was our go-to place for liberty. Go in the evening, sit down in one of the bars alongside the square and have a few drinks and tell some stories and so on. And incidentally, the Aviation is where the Palais de Pape is, the Palace of the Pope, when he was no longer in Rome, and they moved him temporarily to Aviation and then back again to Rome. But for that, not the period of time we were there, that was back in the 1100s, I believe, that happened. But the place that saved that same name, Palais de Pope. Let's see.
What time period was this?
Well, this would have been in just past the summer of 46.
Okay.
Just past the summer months of 1946, yeah.
And how were the local people acting at that time? With the war over,
Most of
Americans still there helping?
them, yeah, most of them were very friendly. We didn't have any particular trouble. We used to get aggravated with the French drivers. They had a way of adjusting their headlights that we never could understand because they always put one right straight out in front of them. Well, if you're coming from the opposite direction, you get blinded. And we couldn't figure out what we were going to do. We finally decided we'd put up lights that were adjustable ourselves, like an outside driving light that you could swivel. And we finally put those on 2 or 3 of our trucks. And at night, those are the ones we took, because if one of them popped its high beam at us, we just shot them right back with intensive light. Scare the heck out of them. We didn't have a great deal of sympathy with the French at that time, but they were beginning to bug us to get out of the area. We were ready to go, except that the government wasn't ready for us to go yet.
Right.
With this young fellow and I were there for 14 days, and then we did finally come back, and we got to tell the people all our wonderful experiences in Paris, and we did get to go almost everywhere. At that time, the Louvre Museum was not open. It had been completely disarrayed as far as where things were stored and everything else. The French had moved them into as secure places as they could to try to preserve them, and they hadn't put them back on display and that kind of thing. So it wasn't open at that time. But every place else, we stopped at Notre Dame Cathedral, and
I think you have a picture of that, don't you?
Yeah, that's a picture of Notre Dame, and one of us standing there in front of it. It was pleasant to be there, and the French in Paris were more receptive than most of the rest were, as far as the GIs were concerned. But I'm sorry, I lost it again. I
Okay.
left in December of 46.
Okay,
Yeah, I guess we can start there again.
Good.
Um, in December of 1946, I got my orders to come home, and they were sending groups of us home, 4 or 5 at a time. And in my group there were 4, and we went up to Paris and then on to Bremerhaven, Germany, which was just a place where you got on the ship to come back home. And we sat around there for a week or 2 before we actually got an assignment to a ship to go on. One of the things that was kind of funny about being there was that they didn't know what to do with us to keep us occupied while they got all their ducks in a row. But one day they asked me to I didn't ask, it was an order, to guard the German prisoners. And for that, they gave me a GI M1 rifle. And it was kind of funny because the sergeant who handed it to me, I looked at it and I said, okay, has it got any ammunition in it? If it does or doesn't, what do I do? I had never held one before. Our training was with the carbine, and of course it was much smaller and much simpler, all that sort of thing. But anyway, I walked around pretending to supervise these German prisoners for a day with the M1 Garand. But then we did finally get assigned to a ship, and this time to come home it was on the Marine Angel. And the Marine Angel was one of the victory ships. The victory ships, though, were not all alike. They started off with it just improved as it went along, and the victory ship was about the 5th generation of these automated ships. These are the ones that were built en masse by the people here in the United States. Push them all together and build these ships in a big hurry, and that's what they did. Anyway, they were noted, the early ships were noted for failing, but these
failing in what way?
well, as I mentioned, they had a turnover rate that they couldn't exceed 45-degree tilt, or they would turn over in the water. Not
Right.
a good thing.
No, not a good thing.
But that improved as they went along, and the Marine Angel that we were on coming home was much better. It was much more stable, and the mess hall for food and everything was much better organized than they were on the ships going over. So anyway.
How many soldiers were on that ship coming home?
Well, there were, I believe, 800 roughly on the ship coming back. But of course ours wasn't the only ship in the convoy. We were still using the zigzag course to come home. We used it to go over and we used it to come back, even though the war was over and had been for quite some time. There were some German submarines that had not been accounted for. And until they knew where they were and whether they were inoperable or not, they weren't going to go back to just sailing like a pleasure ship. So anyway, they finally got us. It took about 14 days to come back. But big ships today do it in 4 or 5 days.
Okay.
But anyway, we got back to New York City, and it was only about a week or two after we got back in the ship that we were processed for discharge. We were never stationed on any base, just there to get everything straightened up and get all the paperwork finished so that they could declare that we got home safe.
Were you enlisted or were you drafted? Did you enlist
Enlisted.
or were you drafted?
I was enlisted.
Okay.
That was very evident at the time because all of the serial numbers of the people who enlisted started with a 1, and those who were not enlisted people had other numbers, 4, 5,
Okay.
and that indicated a different way that they were in the service.
Since it was so late in the war when you entered, did you have any idea that it was winding down?
No. Well, we knew Germany had already decided to quit. That was in like June of 45.
Mhm.
June of 45, I think Germany had completely capitulated, and they were completely occupied as far as being secure is concerned. But now the Japanese, of course, they followed later, and like I said, the first atomic bomb was dropped on August the 6th, and the second one on the 9th, I think, and it was only about 2 weeks after that that the Japanese capitulated and gave up. But up until then, there was still the danger. We didn't
Sure.
like the idea that they might send us home and then send us right on over to Japan.
No.
Not to happen. It just didn't go that way.
Well, that's good.
I think all of us that were in the service together were glad for the experience, for the ability to travel so much and to see so many things around the world, and to have been left very little danger as far as any environment or anything was concerned, or even the people.
Right.
So it was a pleasant experience
Well,
for
that
me.
is good. And we have this picture of a young man. This is you when you entered?
No, that's taken inside of the German prisoner camp.
Oh, it is.
Yes, that was where we actually worked each day.
Okay.
But I can tell it's pretty near to time to come home because I had my sergeant stripes,
Okay.
and I only had those for a couple of months, maybe 2 months, 3 months before we came home.
Do I see a mustache in that picture?
I'm sorry?
Did you have a mustache?
In that picture, I did, I think. Yes.
I think so too.
But I didn't normally. That was near the very end of our stay over there, and nobody really made much bones about what we did or how we dressed or anything else. Our next highest supervisor was in Germany, and that was a long ways away.
Yeah.
We once we got done loading all the equipment that we had that belonged to the government, U.S. government, on trains, flat cars that were hauled up to Germany, and once that was done, we were going to vacate the base completely. And when I left, there were only about 4 GIs left there.
Ah.
And there were still maybe 500 German prisoners that hadn't been shipped back home yet.
Yeah.
But that happened very quickly right after that.
So you came home, and what did you do after the war?
I tried to go to UC, the University of Cincinnati, but after about the first 4 or 5 months, I wasn't doing well in algebra, and advanced algebra that was, of course, and I had an attack of appendicitis,
Ah.
and by the time I took 2 weeks off to be operated on, I figured I couldn't do it anymore. I joined the program at Cincinnati Millitron, Cincinnati Milling Machine Company then, as a trainee. And it took 3 years, 4 years to finish that training before I went on to become something else.
Okay, and you married soon after?
I married, yes, I married in 1948. Yeah, 48.
Had
I
you
had to
known
think
your
about that a minute.
Had you known your wife from before the war?
No, we met the first week that I was home. When I did get home, I called one of my Army buddies, or one of my high school buddies, and he wasn't doing anything, so he came down and he and I were going to go out on the town. And this was my first weekend at home. And he was standing by the front door, I suppose, but anyway, he yelled at me. I was still upstairs getting dressed. And he yelled at me and, hey, he said, Pat's going by. Pat Giblin lived about 4 doors from my house there. And she had been in our high school class all the way through and that sort of thing. And so my buddy yelled up at me and he said, hey, Pat's going by. And I said, well, invite her in. And he said, she's got somebody with her. I said, well, invite them both in. And that's how I met my wife.
Very nice.
That's very interesting and very, very nice that we did hit it off that first night. And we dated for almost a year and then married.
And you had children?
2 boys. Yeah, at least we got a chance to carry on the Kinner name. I was an only son of an only son, and now we provided the world with 2 Kinners.
Right.
And they're both happily married, large families,
Very
all that
nice.
kind of stuff.
Very nice.
It's very good.
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to tell us?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything that I can think of right off.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kinner, we sure do appreciate your time,
I hope somebody
sharing
finds
your
it in.
story. Many generations will like to hear this.
I hope so. It'd be nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.